I'm here tonight with Hedy Rubinger. She's a partner with a law firm of Arnow, Goldman, Gregory. She's got 20 years of healthcare legal practice, so we are dealing with a true specialist in the healthcare regulatory law. Hedy, as an attorney, you have been specializing in regulatory approvals necessary for buyers to get acquisitions done in the senior care market. Are there any tricks of the trade that you have come across in your 20 years that you specifically advise your clients to do or not to do in the process?
Absolutely, yes. The most important thing is to have a game plan up front. And if you're dealing with a multi-state transaction, which is often the case, or if you're dealing with multiple types of providers within a given state, then you have various layers of approvals that you need to make sure that you obtain before your transaction can close. So, in every state, you need to go through a licensure process. If you're dealing with a change of ownership or even a change of control in most states, you need to deal with your Medicare provider agreement. You need to deal with your Medicaid provider agreement. And in many states, for many types of providers, you have to go through a CON or Certificate of Need approval process. So the most important trick of the trade is to know the universe of what you're dealing with up front. And what we do is we have a whole game plan because we do this throughout the country and for various types of providers, and we line everything up so that we can get to the finish line at the same time. And we really understand the nuances of each state and what needs to happen in terms of hearings, applications, financial reporting, so that we build in a timeline so that it can all conclude concurrently.
Which is why your clients probably prefer to hire you and not to have to do it themselves, because it's a little complicated.
It is a little complicated, and we also try to do it so that there's the least amount of disruption at the actual operator or provider level.
What ends up being the biggest problem that results in delays? I know transaction people always say, oh, we're waiting for regulatory approval. What's the big issue? The time bomb.
Yeah, the time bomb is changing the transaction midway. So that once you have your application filed, you want to make sure that that application is complete and then you're not going back to the regulators with any changes. And what happens is that oftentimes tax issues and other business issues are not necessarily considered on the front end. And so we file the application, and then when the tax guys get involved, they realize that the structure of the transaction needs to change. And so we're going back to the regulators and asking for a do-over, if you will. And in some instances, that will start the clock anew.
Over the years, as the approval process, has it become easier or harder?
I would say it's become harder.
Really?
Although in many instances, the laws have not necessarily changed, and even the applications haven't changed. The level of scrutiny has increased. And we're seeing, especially with a change of control, we're seeing that there's increased scrutiny at the actual individuals even who are at the top of the ownership, as opposed to just looking at the operator at a real base level. And the buzzword for the last few years has been transparency. And we're actually seeing that the regulators really want to know much more about who's ultimately in charge of the nursing homes and caring for the residents in their states.
Are there any states that are the most difficult for the process and the easiest?
There is a great deal of variety amongst the states. And even within a given state, the CON process might be very difficult, but yet the licensure process is relatively simple. So we just have a feel at this point of where the hot buttons are, and we know to focus on those, get those going first, and then the rest will fall into place so that we can move the process along.
But you don't want to name anything
no,
easy or hard states.
I know which ones they are.
You got your career. Some states do a pretty thorough look back on a buyer in the other states that they operate in, check on any quality issues, that kind of a thing. How far back do they usually look, and are they really only looking at the serious quality care issues, or looking for anything?
Well, they typically, if they do a look back, not every state does, but the states that do, they go back 10 years, which is quite a long time. And they take a look at that, and what they're looking at are patterns of quality of care problems for the most part. But what happens is our clients that focus on buying a distressed portfolio will, because they're buying a challenged building, they will have problems. And so it's really up to us to convince the regulators that they shouldn't necessarily penalize our client when our client comes back in the next time to do another deal, and then they're looking at the distressed one. It becomes a domino effect. So we really work hard with the regulators to come up with creative solutions so that they can approve the deal enough that we can get the deal closed, and then we sometimes have workarounds with the states.
And when they go back historically and they do find a problem, are they relatively pragmatic in how they deal with that and understanding when there's a logical explanation?
That varies as well, but what we've done
State
in the
by
past,
state.
that varies state by state and regulator by regulator, and as you would expect. But what we've done is we have worked out with states where we will sign some sort of agreement with the state so that we can actually get our approval, but we will have compliance requirements that are over and beyond what would otherwise be required in the state. So that's one workaround. Another workaround is to have a provisional license so that we make it through the process, but then we have to come back in a certain number of years so that the state looks to see how the operator is doing under the new ownership. And then we'll give a permanent license at that point.
Have you done any regulatory work for not-for-profit providers? And if you have, is it different?
Well, it's different in that you have a few more issues that you have to deal with. As I mentioned before, you typically, the biggies are licensure, Medicare, Medicaid, and CON. When you're dealing with a nonprofit, you also have to work in the Attorney General approval process that's required in many states, which will involve a hearing in many instances, and you also, in certain states, have a different certificate of need approval process if you're dealing with a nonprofit.
Is it easier or harder?
Harder.
Harder, okay.
Or not necessarily harder, but just one more factor that you have to factor in and make sure you leave enough time to get through the approval process.
And I know a lot of your work, if not the majority, has been in the skilled nursing area. Do you see on the assisted living side, are you seeing where the regulatory approval process, if you do any of those transactions, is that getting worse? And do you ever see it kind of becoming like skilled nursing 10 years ago? From an approval process?
Yeah, from the approval process, we do a great deal of assisted living work. And what we're seeing is that it is every bit as complicated in certain states on the licensure side. Now, what you eliminate when you're dealing with assisted living is you eliminate any Medicare approval, and you're, in most instances, eliminating Medicaid approvals, unless the assisted living has a special program with the state. But within a state, there's oftentimes various levels of assisted living. So you can even have a different process depending on the level of assisted living. And what we also find is that in some states, assisted living facilities must be surveyed before they go through a change of ownership process as opposed to after. And that's something that needs to be factored in, and you just need to know that that could be coming, and that could be a cause of delay if you aren't aware of it.
How does one keep track of all the regulatory issues for skilled nursing? Then you have assisted living and the various gradations of assisted living, and you've got 50 states. Do you really keep track of that much, or?
It's a team approach, and we do.
That's good, and they're constantly changing.
Yes, so it makes it more complicated for to get a deal done, but that's our job.
Now, the acquisition market, as I'm sure you know, has been pretty quiet in 2009. Do you, through your clients, are you seeing any uptick? And do you, obviously you're not going to breach any confidentiality, but do you feel like there's a bit more momentum going on, where they're talking about more transactions coming on?
I would say yes is the answer to that, but what we're really seeing is that our clients are spending more time focused inward, and they're restructuring, they're refinancing, and in many instances, a restructure and or refinancing requires a regulatory approval process. So we're seeing more of that type of introspective work, and we're seeing smaller transactions than we saw, back in 2007, the year of the mega transactions. But we are seeing some positive signs for 2010.
Okay, good. All right, well, thanks for spending time with me.
Sure.
All right, it was a pleasure. Thank you.